So, several years ago, I was a presenter at an event that was being held at an Episcopal church, and it was the Saturday before the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, and this was something this church did every year to learn about and address the issue of racism in our country and civil rights more broadly. And I was on the program to do a presentation about at the time at least, a relatively unknown movement where some people use their religious beliefs to justify and to promote a vision of America that has some inherently racist origins. It's the ideology that America was founded as a distinctly Christian nation by and for white Protestant Christians. And knowingly or unknowingly, how these folks really make things worse, not better, for people of color or for immigrants or really for anyone who's not a white Christian Protestant who also shares their worldview. So, I showed up at that church and I was met at the door by a volunteer, and this man asked me who I was, and I said, well, I'm David Green, and I'm here to give a presentation. And he smiled and looked at me and said, oh, welcome, I know who you are. You're a bringer of light. And I'd never been called that before, so I was kind of taken aback. It sounded like a nice thing. I said, well, I don't know if that's true, buddy, but I'll do my best to be as bright as possible. But later I thought to myself, wow, what a great way to greet someone. Anyone, really. You're a bringer of light. It's a wonderful affirmation. Imagine saying that to the cashier at the grocery store. They would have no idea what you're talking about, but it'd be fun. Better yet, seriously, imagine saying that to your child's or your grandchild's teacher, or to your child or grandchild, or you could even say it to your next door neighbor, but they might then wonder what it is you want to borrow from them. In any situation, it might require some explanation on your part, so we'll get to that in a minute. Now, I still don't know how much light I brought that particular day at that Episcopal church. But the more that I thought about it, and coincidentally, the more I began to study our scripture passage for today, I have decided to try to use that phrase when I meet people, not only at church, but of course, but maybe especially here at church, because if you have never heard this before, you are a bringer of light. Or more to the point, really, you are light itself. And you might not have known this, but not only are you light, you're also salt. Salt and light. Why? Because Jesus said so. Now, there are absolutely some places in the Bible where we can act like observers. We're like members of an audience munching on popcorn, waiting for the story to unfold. Not today. Matthew is describing for us the sermon, a part of the Sermon on the Mount, and it is as clear as one of these bells we just heard, that although he is setting a scene, Matthew's setting a scene of Jesus speaking to this really vast group of people, Matthew wants us to see ourselves as part of that crowd. Now, it happened rather early in Jesus' ministry, and you might consider it his inaugural address in a way, laying out his vision of how God creates us to live and how we are called to treat one another. How you and I are called to navigate the world so that we'll understand and we'll enjoy what it means to have life and to have that life abundantly. Now, to do that, Jesus says, we ought to understand ourselves and regard other people as salt and as light. Because if we do that, it really changes everything. Complete perspective shift. So, let's start with salt. You're the salt of the earth. What does that even mean? Carolyn gave us a few hints. These days, saying she's the salt of the earth, well, that's a nice compliment. It means the person is what? Solid, dependable, honest, hardworking, down to earth. They're the genuine article. You can always count on them to show up when the going gets tough. Salt of the earth. And that's not too far off from what Jesus meant by that phrase 2,000 years ago. But he also meant something a whole lot more. Salt's cheap these days, but back then it was a highly prized commodity. It was traded, just like money. Before refrigeration, salt was used to store food so it would not spoil. You cured meat and fish in salt so it wouldn't go bad. Added flavor. But even more importantly, perhaps, it kept essential things safe. It was used for all kinds of medicinal purposes. It was a purifying agent. Now, we all know that salt poured on a wound hurts like fire, but it also protects against infection. It can save your life. So, stay salty, Jesus says, in your life and in your relationships. Be that valuable commodity. Be that prize person who preserves. Be that person who protects. Be that person who refuses to let things go bad. Be that person who heals. And the good news is, we're already salty. God made us that way according to Jesus. He makes it clear that being salty is not something that we just ought to do. It's built into us from the start. It's a gift that we're carrying around like Santa Claus on Christmas Eve. And so Jesus says we must use that gift within us. Don't ignore it. Don't let it go to waste. And we possess a never-ending supply of saltiness. It cannot go away. It can't be used up because it's just our nature. Most importantly, we're made that way for a good reason. And that is to be an instrument of helping others. A good friend of mine named Jack Graves, he was a member of a church I once served long ago. Now, Jack, he was a character. He was a retired federal marshal, and boy, did he look the part. He was built like an NFL linebacker. He moved like John Wayne, this. And I used to ask him if he modeled himself after that, and he said, no, it was the other way around. But you would not want to mess with Jack Graves. And, he was a member of my church, but he was a salty guy in his gruff manner and very salty in some of the language he used. But Jack lived way out in the country on a small ranch where he raised longhorn cattle as a hobby. And we used to have breakfast together once a week at this Greasy Spoon diner. But Jack, he had a lot of sorrow in his life. His wife had died when she was young. He had also lost a son. And he lived all by himself with a bulldog named Rosie. But here's the truly salty part about Jack. He was getting older and he felt like he was slowing down a bit. And he told me more than once over breakfast. He believed he had a special purpose that kept him going. And he wondered if it was something that he had learned along the way, this special purpose, but he really didn't think so. It felt more to him like something that he was just compelled to do. He had to do it. His special purpose was doing good things for other people without letting them know anything about it. It's kind of a fun game. It brought him a lot of joy. So Jack would drive around, and if he saw a fence that needed mending, he would go buy the materials, grab his tools, and come back and fix that fence. If someone had a tree fall on their property, he would find out when they were going to be away from home, and he would take his chainsaw and cut up the tree into pieces that could be used for firewood. Now, the funny thing was, Jack only thought that his secret good deeds were a secret. It did not take long at all for people in that small community to figure out that Jack Graves was responsible. So one day, someone told me they were throwing a surprise birthday party for Jack, and they were going to invite a lot of people, but especially all the people that he had helped, which was just about everybody around there. And they needed me to conspire with them to surprise Jack. And so on his birthday, I called him up and I said, come over to the church and help me fix the light fixture, And so when he walked into the fellowship hall, about 200 people were there waiting for him. And they all yelled, "Happy birthday!" And he was so shocked, I thought he was going to keel over. And this big, tough, retired federal marshal just stood there weeping like a baby. And he looked at me and said, "I never knew I had so many friends." It was a lot like George Bailey in that film, It's a Wonderful Life, dramatically being faced with the positive impact of his life. My friend Jack did have an impact, and many, many friends, because he was so very salty. And the second part of this formula, Jesus says, is that we are the light of the world. Not only are we created to make a positive difference in the lives of others, but by doing that, it makes a positive, visible difference in our own life. So we're also made to be a bright light, not shielded from view, not hiding under a bushel, but visible for everyone to see. And just like our saltiness, light is something that we already possess, and it's waiting to be revealed by what we do. So I think we can think of it this way. Salty behavior and being light are really cause and effect. Light naturally radiates from good things. Another friend of mine was Myrna Rafkind. Now, when I first met Myrna, she was 95 years old, well known as a community activist. And she was born in a well-to-do Jewish family. But as a child and young adult, she was the victim of anti-Semitism. Myrna knew firsthand the sting of discrimination, of not being allowed into certain stores, not being invited to certain events. And when she was a schoolgirl, she was not included in some social clubs. But Myrna was one of the most positive, energetic, and tireless people I've ever met. And we got to know each other because she was a leader in her synagogue, and we served together on the board of an interfaith coalition. Sometimes I would go to her synagogue on Friday nights, and she would often show up at my church on Sunday mornings. But Myrna had this habit. She would clip out newspaper articles and mail them to me. They were news stories where someone or some group of people was in trouble. And she would attach a note to that saying, "David, we can fix this problem." And many nights, often late at night, Ellen can attest to this, after I'd already gone to bed, Myrna would call and wake me up and say something like, I don't know when she slept, she'd say something like, "David, I think we ought to do something about making sure the Somali refugees in town know that they're welcome here, so why don't you host a dinner for them, and I'll get things organized." And I'd say, "Sure, Myrna, that sounds great." What else could I say? The thing is, I never tired of getting involved in Myrna's projects because you just felt drawn to her. I was attracted to her overwhelmingly positive attitude that everyone matters. And the reason we exist is to make a positive difference for other people. I was drawn to Myrna, and no one I knew ever said no to her. Why? Because her light was so contagious. With people like Myrna, we're drawn to their light, and we're inspired to join our light with theirs. With people like her, we know we have the light within ourselves, but because they've sparked it and they've pointed it out to us. And that's what I want to point out today. We are salty and we are light, each and every one of us. Please believe that about yourself because it's absolutely true, and I have seen it. We were made that way by God. And here's what I want each of us to do. Try this week. Point out that truth to others within your own orbit. Let the person know whom you love the most. Tell them today. Call them if they're not here. And tell the person you don't know yet that they are a salty bringer of light. And if they don't have a clue what you're talking about, explain why. That we're made that way and invested with salt and light for a purpose. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." In these times we live in, let's be salty bringers of light in the conversations we hold, and our everyday interactions, and all the ways that we drive out hate and that we embody God's love. And one person at a time, our salty light will change everything. Amen.